The Chamber of Voices had not gone silent in 400 years. It was doing so now. Ambassador Trenkal of the Solari Compact stood at the central podium, his crystalline vocal ridges still trembling with the aftershock of his own laughter, and watched the silence spread outward like a stain. Delegates from 61 member species sat frozen in their gravity cradles, their attention no longer on him, but on the tactical display rotating above the chamber floor. A single crimson icon that had appeared in council space without invitation, without escort, and without the faintest trace of fear. One ship, Human Registry, UNS Prometheus's debt. It's a joke, Trenkal said, though the certainty had drained out of his voice. It has to be a joke. Their entire war fleet consists of what, 40 vessels? And they send one into Sovereign Council space? Councillor Vesadaru, the presiding chief arbiter of the Sundering Accord, did not laugh. Ves had lived 190 standard years, had watched 3 species rise and 1 species die, and had learned that the universe reserved its cruelest lessons for those who mistook silence for weakness. Query the vessel, Ves said quietly. The comm officer, a young thrall with feathered audial slits that had gone rigid with tension, complied. The council's translation matrix hummed to life, ready to render whatever guttural, primitive dialect the humans still clung to into civilized concordant speech. The answer came back in flawless concordant, delivered in a voice so calm it unsettled half the chamber more than a threat would have. This is Captain Elena Reyes, commanding officer of the UNS Prometheus's debt. On behalf of the Sovereign Terran Assembly, we are here to observe. Continue your session. Pretend we're not here. A ripple of scandalized muttering went through the chamber. Trenkal's ridges flared crimson with fresh outrage. Pretend, he sputtered. Pretend you're not here? You are inside a debate concerning whether your species is fit for full council membership, and you expect us to simply ignore an armed incursion?
It's not an incursion, Reyes said.
It's an RSVP. Laughter erupted across half the chamber, the sharp, cutting kind that predators use to remind prey of its place. The Grelithi delegation, six-limbed and perpetually smug, actually applauded. Even Vesadaru allowed the ghost of something that might have been amusement to cross his weathered features. Humanity had been a known quantity to the Council for 11 years, ever since first contact with a Solari survey vessel near the edge of what humans called the Kuiper Belt. In that time, the species had been catalogued, assessed, and quietly filed away in the Council's vast archive of civilizations under a designation that translated, roughly as promising but unready. The file was not wrong. By any reasonable metric, humanity possessed exactly one true warship class worth the name, a scattering of research vessels retrofitted with weapons never meant for war, and a population still recovering from 3 devastating regional conflicts that had, by cosmic standards, happened only yesterday. Their engines were a full technological generation behind Solari standard. Their shields flickered under sustained fire from even second-tier council weaponry. Their entire navy combined displaced less mass than a single Grelithi capital ship. And yet here was one of their ships, sitting in the most heavily defended, most jealously guarded stretch of space in the known galaxy, transmitting requests as if it held every card at the table. This is a formal council proceeding, Ves said, raising a hand to quiet the chamber. Deliberations regarding a species' fitness for provisional membership require the presence of accredited representatives only. Captain Reyes, your vessel will withdraw to the designated observer perimeter, 11 light minutes distant, or it will be considered a hostile presence and dealt with accordingly. There was a pause. Not a long one, just long enough for Ves to feel, for reasons he could not articulate, a faint unease crawl up the back of his neck. Copy that, Counselor, Reyes said. One correction, though. We're not an observer today. We're a party to these proceedings. Check your docket. Ves did not need to check the docket. He remembered it perfectly, because he had personally scheduled it 3 weeks prior, back when the notion of Terran membership had still felt like an academic exercise, a formality to be processed and dismissed with the appropriate diplomatic courtesies. Item 17. Formal review. Continued provisional status of the Terran Sovereign Assembly. Presiding question. Does humanity, as currently constituted, pose an unacceptable risk to Council stability, sufficient to warrant downgrade to quarantine protocol status? Quarantine protocol. the polite council term for a species judged too dangerous, too erratic, or too primitive to be trusted with unrestricted access to interstellar space, a designation that came with border enforcement fleets, with weapons embargoes, with the kind of protective restrictions that had, in the Council's 400-year history, never once been lifted from a species that received them. 3 species currently lived under quarantine protocol. None of them had ever been permitted to leave it. The docket, Trenkal said with poorly concealed relish, exists precisely because your species has demonstrated a pattern of behavior the Council finds troubling. Reckless colonization beyond sanctioned boundaries, weapons development that violates 17 separate non-proliferation clauses, and may I remind the Chamber, an unauthorized military engagement 8 months ago against a Kryvex raiding fleet in what the Kryvex themselves classify as contested space. We call that an unauthorized rescue, Reyes said. The Kryvex were 3 hours from glassing a Threll mining colony. 9,000 civilians. We didn't check whose paperwork said the space belonged to whom. We just went. The Threll comm officer's audio slits, which had been rigid, now trembled with something that was not tension at all. That colony, she said, so quietly the translation matrix almost missed it, was my mother's colony. Nobody responded to her. The Council did not make room for personal testimony from junior staff during formal proceedings, and in the charged silence that followed, Vesadaru found himself doing something he had not done in a debate chamber in over a decade. He listened to the silence instead of filling it. The point remains, Trenkal pressed on, sensing the room's attention drifting and moving to reclaim it, that humanity acts first and requests permission never. It is a species defined by impulse, by sentiment, by the kind of reckless individual heroics that make for compelling mythology and catastrophic policy. You cannot build a stable galactic order on the foundation of a species that runs into burning buildings, instead of calling for the appropriate emergency response protocol. Funny, Reyes said. Most of the species in your council who could have helped that colony didn't run into the burning building. They filed a report about the fire. The Grelithi ambassador's smugness curdled into something colder. You are, Captain, currently a single vessel inside a defensive perimeter patrolled by 11 Council border cruisers, each one exceeding your ship's combat rating by a factor of 4. I would recommend a tone more befitting your position. Noted, Reyes said. There was something in her voice now. Not defiance exactly, but a kind of patient, terrible calm. The calm of someone who has already run every version of this conversation in their head and is simply waiting for the room to catch up. For the record, Counselor Vess, we're not here to threaten anyone. We came because Item 17 determines whether 9 billion human beings get to keep their freedom of movement in this galaxy, and my government decided that was worth showing up for in person. That's all. We'll sit quietly while you debate our fate. I just wanted you to see our faces while you do it. Vesadaru studied the tactical display a long moment, studied the crimson icon that refused, with a stubbornness that felt almost personal, to retreat to the observer perimeter as ordered. Beside him, Counselor Ofre Den of the Vethrai Compact leaned close. Her voice pitched low enough that the translation matrix barely caught it. Best precedent matters here. If we let one armed vessel dictate the terms of its own presence at a sovereignty hearing, every provisional species in the archive will demand the same courtesy. You will be setting fire to 400 years of procedure to accommodate a single stubborn captain. I am aware of the precedent, Ofre, Vess said. I am also aware that a fleet with nothing to hide does not usually need to be reminded that it agreed to remain unarmed. You think this is a bluff? I think, Vess said slowly, watching the crimson icon hold its position, with a patience that unsettled him more than aggression would have, that I have sat through 400 provisional hearings, and not one species has ever sent a warship to watch its own trial. That alone tells me something the file on my desk does not. Ofre did not look convinced, but she said nothing further as Vess raised his hand for order. Very well, he said finally, against the visible objections of half his fellow counselors. The Terran vessel may remain at the perimeter's edge, under the strict condition that weapons remain powered down and all systems register as passive throughout these proceedings. Any deviation will be treated as an act of war against the Council and will be answered as one. Do you understand these terms, Captain Reyes? Understood, Counselor, Reyes said. Weapons cold. You have my word. Your word, Trenkal repeated, with the particular contempt of a being who had spent his entire career learning to distrust anything that could not be verified by sensor telemetry. "Forgive me, Captain, if the Council places greater faith in instrumentation than in the promises of a species with your history of unilateral action." "That's fair," Rhea said without a trace of offense. "Verify it however you like. We're not going anywhere." The Chamber's engineering staff spent the next several minutes running deep scan diagnostics against Prometheus's debt, and the results, when they finally scrolled across Vesadaru's console, were exactly what the Terran captain had promised. Weapons arrays cold, targeting systems dark, shields at standard cruise configuration rather than combat readiness. It was by every technical measure the Council possessed, an unarmed ship sitting calmly inside the single most dangerous piece of real estate in the galaxy. "Satisfied?" Reyes asked, when the diagnostic confirmation pinged across the open channel. Trenkal did not answer. He returned instead to his podium, gathered the scattered threads of his prepared remarks, and resumed the proceeding with the brittle determination of a man trying to convince a room and himself that nothing about the last several minutes had actually changed anything, what none of them understood. Not Vesadaru, not Trenkal, not the 11 border cruisers holding formation around a single human ship they outnumbered, and outgunned by every metric the Council valued, was that Prometheus's debt had not come to threaten them, it had come to bear witness. And humanity, as the Council was about to learn in ways it could not yet imagine, had a long and inconvenient habit of turning the act of bearing witness into something the universe remembered. The debate resumed, and for the better part of an hour it proceeded exactly as Trenkal had scripted it. Delegate after delegate rose to enumerate humanity's failings, with the practiced cadence of prosecutors who already knew the verdict. They cited casualty statistics from humanity's own recorded history, wars fought over ideology, over resources, over grievances centuries old, as though ancient scars were somehow proof of present danger. They cited the unauthorized rescue at the Threll colony, not as an act of courage but as evidence of a species that could not be trusted to respect boundaries. They cited humanity's refusal, 3 separate times, to hand over its independent weapons research to Council oversight. Captain Reyes listened to all of it without a single interruption. Her ship sat at the very edge of the defensive perimeter, running cold and quiet, weapon systems dark exactly as promised, its crew visible on internal cameras, going about routine duties with an unhurried professionalism that several delegates found more unnerving than any show of aggression could have been. It was Vesadaru who finally noticed the pattern nobody else seemed to be tracking. Every delegate who spoke against humanity cited fear, fear of unpredictability, fear of independence, fear of a species that made decisions on instinct instead of consensus. Not one of them cited an actual atrocity committed against another Council species. Not one of them could point to a single occasion where humanity had struck first, without provocation, against anyone. They feared humanity not for what it had done, but for what it might someday choose to do without asking permission first. He watched Delegate Corvain Ith of the Ferret Assembly rise next, a being whose entire species had built its council, standing on centuries of meticulous, unbroken procedural compliance, and listened as Ith delivered what was, by any measure, the most damning testimony of the session, not because it was hostile, but because it was delivered with genuine, wounded confusion. "I do not say this to condemn," Ith began, his 4 eyes tracking independently across the chamber in the nervous pattern his species displayed under stress. "I say this because I do not understand. The Terran species entered this council 11 years ago. In that time they have built weapons we did not sanction, colonized worlds outside agreed boundaries, and intervened in disputes that were not theirs to settle. And yet in every recorded interaction, they have harmed no member species. They have, if the record is honest, saved several. I do not understand a species that behaves this way. I do not know how to build policy around a people who cannot be predicted, even when their unpredictability keeps producing outcomes the rest of us would call good ones." It was, Vess thought, the most honest sentence spoken in the chamber all day, and it was also the sentence that revealed, more clearly than any accusation Trenkal had made, the actual shape of the Council's fear. 400 years of governance had been built on the assumption that safety required predictability, that a species could only be trusted once its behavior could be modeled, anticipated, and controlled. Humanity had spent 11 years proving itself capable, generous, and fiercely effective, and utterly, defiantly resistant to being modeled by anyone. Ves Adaru had sat on this council for 19 years. He had watched species after species join under provisional status, prove their obedience, and settle quietly into the vast, orderly machinery of council governance. Humanity, in 11 years, had done nothing of the sort. It had rescued a colony that was not its responsibility. It had built weapons the council had not sanctioned. It had sent a single ship into the most defended space in the galaxy, and calmly requested a seat at its own trial. It occurred to Ves, watching that patient crimson icon hold its position at the perimeter's edge, that he might be looking at something the Council's 400 years of precedent had never actually prepared it to judge. He found himself thinking, unbidden, of a report he had read 3 years earlier, one of hundreds that crossed his desk each cycle, most forgotten within the hour, concerning a Terran research outpost on the edge of surveyed space that had lost contact with its supply convoy during an unanticipated ion storm. The report had noted, almost as an afterthought, that the convoy's escort, a single lightly armed Terran corvette, had held position inside the storm for 6 days rather than abandon the outpost to wait out the weather alone, its hull icing over, its crew rationing power to keep the outpost's life support online instead of their own heating systems. The report had filed the incident under notable operational anomaly and moved on to the next item. Ves Adaru had not thought about that report in 3 years. He thought about it now, watching a single warship sit unarmed and unflinching inside a kill zone 11 council cruisers could have erased in under a minute, and felt the first true crack form in an assessment of humanity he had until this afternoon, considered thoroughly and permanently settled. He did not yet know how right he was. That understanding would not arrive gently. It would arrive in fire 3 hours later, when the debate chamber's calm shattered into something no member of the council had planned for, and one human warship, alone against overwhelming odds, would show them all exactly what happens when a species finally runs out of patience for being underestimated. The first sign that something had gone catastrophically wrong came not from the debate chamber, but from the tactical net, a soft, insistent chime that every officer in the room had been trained since childhood to dread. Perimeter breach. Not the human ship. Prometheus's debt remained exactly where it had been for the last 2 hours. Weapons cold, drifting at the observer boundary with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. The breach was coming from the opposite direction, from beyond the outer defense ring, where a swarm of unregistered contacts had begun bleeding out of subspace in numbers that made the tactical officer's voice crack on the first report. Unidentified fleet. Sir Counselor 40, no 61 hostile signatures, decloaking on the outer perimeter, weapons hot across the entire formation. Trencal's crystalline ridges drained of color. That's impossible. Nothing decloaks inside the defense grid. The grid predates the Sundering Accord itself. It has never been breached. F returns as Kryvex War configuration, the officer continued, voice climbing toward panic. Counselor, this isn't a raiding party. This is a full invasion fleet, the Kryvex. Ves Adaru felt the floor of his certainty drop away beneath him. The Kryvex Dominion had been a festering border conflict for the Council's outer territories for the better part of a decade. Raiders, opportunists, occasionally full war fleets when they smelled weakness, but they had never, not once in 400 years of Council history, possessed the technology to breach a perimeter grid this deep in sovereign space, which meant someone had given it to them, or someone had found a flaw the Council itself had never detected. Alarms began sounding throughout the chamber. The deep concussive tone reserved for existential threats, and for the first time in living memory, the Council of 61 species did not debate. It scrambled. Delegates who moments earlier had been calmly reciting statistics about human recklessness were now shouting contradictory orders into comm units, demanding evacuation protocols, demanding someone explain how this had happened. The 11 border cruisers that had spent the last 2 hours holding a smug, superior formation around a single human ship broke ranks entirely, wheeling to face the new threat, and it was immediately, sickeningly obvious to everyone watching the tactical display that 11 cruisers were not going to be enough. The Kryvex fleet outnumbered them nearly 6 to 1, and worse, Their weapon signatures registered far beyond anything the raiders had ever previously deployed. Heavier, faster, disturbingly precise. Vesadaru had commanded exactly one military engagement in his life. 40 years earlier, before he had traded a captain's chair for a counselor's podium, and every instinct that engagement had carved into him screamed the same warning now. He forced himself to study the display rather than react to it. Tracing the shape of the Krivex formation, the way he had once traced enemy dispositions on the bridge of a much smaller ship, in a much smaller war. "They're not raiding," Ves said, staring at the display with a cold, sinking clarity. "Look at the formation. That's not a smash-and-grab pattern. That's a decapitation strike." He was right, and everyone realized it within the same breath he finished speaking. The Krivex fleet wasn't spreading out to plunder outlying stations or soften border defenses. It was driving in a single concentrated wedge, directly toward the Council's central command platform, the massive orbital structure housing not just the debate chamber, but the coordination hub for every defense fleet across 61 member worlds. If that platform fell, or if its command and communication systems were knocked offline in the opening minutes of the assault, the Council's entire defensive apparatus would fracture into 61 uncoordinated militaries, each one blind to what the others were doing, each one easy prey for a fleet that had clearly planned this for a very long time. "Get the evacuation shuttles moving," Ves ordered, forcing his voice to remain level even as his mind screamed at the impossibility of the numbers scrolling past on the display. "All non-essential personnel now." "Counselor, the shuttle bays are on the platform's outer ring," the column officer said, her audio slits flattened in raw fear. "That's exactly where the Krivex formation is converging. We can't get personnel to the bays without crossing directly into their approach vector." Ves understood, in that moment, with the particular clarity that comes only in the final seconds before catastrophe, that he had just watched 400 years of Council supremacy reveal itself to be built on foundations far thinner than anyone had dared imagine. 11 cruisers were already taking fire, their shields flaring and failing under concentrated barrages, and the platform's own point defense systems, designed to repel raiders, never an invasion fleet of this scale, were struggling to track targets fast enough to matter. He watched the tactical projection recalculate the platform's survival odds in real time, the number ticking downward with a cold, mechanical indifference to the 61 species worth of lives it represented. 91%, then 74%, then, as a second wave of Krivex weapons fire tore through the outer cruiser screen, 52%. Somewhere behind him he could hear Trenkal repeating a single phrase to no one in particular, all trace of contempt stripped from his voice. "This cannot be happening, this cannot be happening." Ves found, in that moment, that he agreed with him completely, and that agreeing changed nothing at all. The numbers on the display did not care what any of them believed was possible. The Grelithi ambassador who had applauded Captain Reyes's dismissal 2 hours earlier was now on, his knees behind an overturned podium, his 6 limbs wrapped around himself, making a sound none of the translation matrices had a word for. Elsewhere in the chamber, delegates who had spent decades mastering the art of composed, unreadable diplomacy found that composure dissolving in real time. The ferret delegate Corvain Ith, whose 4 eyes had tracked so nervously across the room during his earlier testimony about humanity's unpredictability, now stood frozen entirely, all 4 eyes locked on the same expanding cluster of hostile icons, as though sheer stillness might somehow keep the violence at bay. Ofri Den, who had warned Ves against setting precedent by accommodating a single-armed ship, was shouting into a comm unit at her own security detail, demanding a status update on evacuation routes that did not exist because no one, in 400 years, had ever believed they would be needed. It was a particular kind of horror, Ves thought distantly, watching his colleagues come apart around him. The horror of beings who had built their entire civilization on the assumption that violence was something that happened to other species, in other systems far from the carefully warded heart of council governance. The defense grid had been a monument to that assumption as much as a military asset, 400 years old, tested against nothing more serious than the occasional smuggler or opportunistic pirate. Its true purpose less to repel invasion than to reassure 61 civilizations that invasion was a problem that belonged to someone else's history. That reassurance was burning away in real time, on every display in the chamber, and nothing in 400 years of council governance had prepared a single person in that room for what came next. It was in this moment, with the chamber dissolving into the particular chaos of beings who had never truly believed themselves mortal, suddenly confronting the possibility in real time, that a voice cut through every comm channel on the platform simultaneously. Calm, clipped and utterly infuriatingly unhurried. Aboard Prometheus's debt, Elena Reyes had not waited for that chime to reach the debate chamber before she was already moving. She had felt the perimeter grid's alarm ripple through her own ship's passive sensors, 3 full seconds before the Council's own commnet caught up, and in those 3 seconds, sitting cold and unarmed exactly as she had promised, she had already made the only decision that mattered. "Marcus, spin up the reactor," she said, not raising her voice, because she had long ago learned that a calm captain built a calm crew, and a calm crew survived. "Full combat readiness, all stations." "We're going in." "Captain, we gave our word," Webb said, even as his hands were already moving across his console, because he had learned, in 3 years serving under Elena Reyes, that she never gave an order she wasn't prepared to answer for. "Weapons cold, remember? If we power up before the Council authorizes it, they'll authorize it," Reyes said. "Nobody watches 61 species get overrun and decides the paperwork matters more than the massacre. Get us combat ready, Marcus. I'm not going to be the reason we were 3 seconds too slow." By the time the request for authorization actually reached Vesadaru's console, Prometheus's debt was already at 90% power, its reactor climbing toward the kind of overcharged state its own engineers had rated as survivable only in the narrowest of emergency windows, its crew strapped into crash restraints and running weapons diagnostics with the clipped, practiced efficiency of people who had trained for this exact scenario more times than any of them cared to remember. Elena Reyes had commanded this crew for 3 years, had chosen most of them herself from a pool of volunteers that had, without exception, understood exactly what kind of mission they were signing on to when they requested a posting aboard a vessel whose sole peacetime assignment was sitting quietly at the edge of hostile diplomatic proceedings, ready to move the instant the people it was protecting needed it to. She had told each of them during their first briefing aboard the ship the same thing her own commanding officer had told her a decade earlier, that the job was not to win wars. The job was to be standing in the gap when the gap needed someone standing in it, and to trust that the rest of humanity back home would still be there to build something worth protecting once the gap was closed. None of them had needed the reminder today. Every station on the bridge had already begun the transition to combat readiness before her order finished leaving her mouth. A crew moving with the wordless, practiced synchrony of people who had run this exact drill and simulation more times than they could count, and who understood in the marrow-deep way that only real danger can teach, that the difference between a drill and the real thing was simply that today, there would be no reset button waiting for them at the end. Council command: "This is Captain Reyes, UNS Prometheus's debt. We're reading your tactical situation, requesting immediate authorization to engage." For a single absurd heartbeat, Vesadaru almost laughed, the same reflexive, disbelieving laugh that had filled the chamber 2 hours earlier, because the idea that one ship, a single vessel the Council's own officers had rated at a quarter, the combat value of any one of the 11 cruisers currently being torn apart, could meaningfully alter this battle was so absurd it bordered on obscene. But he did not have time to laugh, and some instinct, the same instinct that had made him notice the pattern in the Council's fear 2 hours earlier, stopped him. "Authorization granted," he said instead. "Captain Reyes, do whatever you can. God help us all, do whatever you can." There was no acknowledgement. There was no confirmation, no ceremony, no pause. On the tactical display, the crimson icon that had sat motionless at the perimeter's edge for 2 hours simply moved, and the sensor officer's voice, when it came, had lost every trace of the professional detachment it had carried moments before. Counselor, the human vessel, its power signature just spiked to 9 times its baseline reading. I don't understand what I'm looking at." "Sir, that's not possible for a ship that size." Vesadaru stared at the display as Prometheus's debt accelerated toward the Kryvex formation at a velocity the Council's own sensor logs would later confirm exceeded every published performance specification for a vessel of its class by a margin so wide the analysts initially assumed instrument failure. It was not heading toward the flank. where a lone ship might harass the edges of a superior force and retreat. It was heading directly into the teeth of the Kryvex wedge, toward the densest concentration of enemy firepower in the entire engagement. "They're flying into a wall," Trenkal breathed, some ancient, animal part of him too horrified to maintain his earlier contempt. "That ship will be vaporized in seconds." Vesadaru said nothing. He simply watched because some part of him, the same part that had spent 2 hours quietly reassessing everything, he thought he understood about the species standing trial in his chamber, suspected that the Council of 61 Worlds was about to learn something about humanity that no amount of statistics, no catalog of ancient wars, no carefully compiled dossier of provisional status violations had ever managed to capture. It was about to learn what humans did when the people they'd sworn to protect were the ones in the burning building. The first Kryvex capital ship in Prometheus's Death's Path fired everything it had, a full spread of heavy ordnance that should have, by every rule the Council understood about warfare, ended the engagement before it began. The human ship did not die. It rolled through the barrage in a maneuver the tactical computer flagged as physically improbable. Weapons blazing to life a half-second before impact, and the Kryvex capital ship's shields collapsed under a return volley so precisely targeted it looked less like combat and more like surgery. "Counselor," the sensor officer said, her voice now barely a whisper, I think that ship just killed a Kryvex cruiser in 11 seconds." Vesadaru leaned forward, his ancient certainty crumbling into something that felt, for the first time in 19 years on this council, genuinely and completely unfamiliar all around him. The chamber's reaction fractured along lines that would, in the days to come, define exactly which delegates had understood what they were witnessing and which had not. Ofri Den, who minutes earlier had been shouting into a comm unit about non-existent evacuation routes, had gone completely still, her eyes fixed on the tactical display with an expression Ves had never before seen on a Vethrai face, something between disbelief and a dawning, painful hope. Corvainith's four eyes had, for the first time since the alarm sounded, stopped their nervous independent tracking and locked, all four, on the same single point, the crimson icon carving a burning path through a fleet that outnumbered it by a factor no council doctrine had ever considered survivable. "That is not possible," Ith said quietly. To no one in particular. "A vessel of that mass class does not survive direct fire from a Kryvex capital ship. I have run the simulations. I have run them 100 times in preparation for exactly this category of threat assessment. There is no scenario in which that ship is still intact. And yet," Ves said, not looking away from the display, "there it is." The second Kryvex vessel in Prometheus's Death's Path adjusted its approach, clearly attempting to correct for whatever had gone wrong in the first engagement, bringing 3 separate weapon batteries to bear in a coordinated spread designed to overwhelm the target from multiple angles simultaneously. It was, by every principle of tactical doctrine the Council's own war colleges taught, the correct response to an enemy that had just demonstrated unexpected maneuverability. It did not matter. Prometheus's debt threaded the gap between the converging fire arcs with a margin so narrow that 3 separate sensor stations across the platform independently flagged the maneuver as a probable data relay error and returned fire with a precision that left the second vessel's engine section venting plasma into the void within seconds. 2. The sensor officer breathed. "Counselor, that's 2 Kryvex warships in under a minute." Trenkal said nothing at all. He simply stood motionless, staring at the display with the particular silence of a being watching every assumption he had built his career on catch fire and burn to nothing in real time. And somewhere in that silence, Vesadaru understood that the debate they had spent the last 2 hours conducting had already, quietly, irrevocably ended, not with a vote, not with a ruling, but with a single human ship refusing, against every reasonable expectation, to die. It was, on some level, the entire history of her species compressed into a single sentence, and every human on that bridge felt the weight of it settle over them, not as pressure, but as purpose. Prometheus's debt was not going to win this fight by playing the odds. It had never been designed to. It was going to win, if it won at all, by refusing to accept that the odds applied to it. Reyes gave the order, and the ship that should not have been able to survive, the last 3 minutes of combat did, something the Kryvex fleet's own tactical computers modeling an enemy vessel against the entire history of Council-recorded warfare had no framework to predict. It reversed thrust, spun through a maneuver that put its dorsal shields directly into the path of the flanking formation's opening volley, and unleashed every remaining weapon system it possessed in a single, devastating alpha strike that gutted 4 Kryvex warships in the space of 6 seconds. The cost was immediate and severe. Reactor output spiked past every safety threshold the ship's engineers had ever tested, alarms screaming across every console on the bridge, and Elena Reyes felt the deck shudder beneath her in a way that told her, with the certainty of a captain who had spent a career learning to read her own ship's pain, that they were now operating on borrowed time measured in minutes, not hours. Shields at 19%, Webb reported, his voice tight. Reactors in the red across the board, Captain. If we take one more concentrated hit, we lose containment entirely. How long until the cruisers can reinforce the breach? 90 seconds, maybe less. They're pushing everything they've got. Then we hold for 90 seconds, Reyes said. 90 seconds on the bridge of a dying ship was not an abstraction. It was Priya Achari, counting down targeting cycles under her breath between clenched teeth, feeding power to weapon systems that had begun failing in sequence. Each console she lost forcing her to reroute through the next viable pathway, with hands that had started, almost imperceptibly, to shake. It was James Okafor moving between 3 separate breach points on the lower decks, sealing what he could with foam and improvisation, abandoning what he couldn't, making split-second triage decisions about which parts of the ship still mattered to the fight and which had already become expendable. It was Marcus Webb watching his reactor readouts climb past every threshold he had spent a career learning never to cross, and choosing, again and again, not to pull the emergency shutdown that would have saved the ship and lost the platform. 90 seconds was an eternity built from 1,000 smaller decisions, each one small enough to seem survivable on its own, each one compounding into the kind of sustained, unbearable pressure that had, throughout the Council's own recorded history, reliably broken even veteran crews. It did not break this one. Whatever it was that held Prometheus's debt together through those 90 seconds, training, or stubbornness, or something neither word fully captured, it held. On the command platform, Vesadaru watched the tactical display with his hands clenched so tightly around the edge of his console that his knuckles had gone pale. And beside him, for the first time in the entire proceeding, Trenkal was silent, not with contempt, not with outrage, but with the particular silence of a being watching every certainty he had ever held about a species dissolve in real time, replaced by something he did not yet have a word for. The human ship held. Battered, bleeding atmosphere from 3 separate hull breaches, its reactor screaming past every limit its own engineers had ever certified as safe. Prometheus's debt held the breach for the full 90 seconds, and when the reinforcing cruisers finally arrived to close the gap, it was still there, wounded, burning but still there, still fighting, still standing between the Kryvex invasion fleet and the 9 billion human beings who would never know how close they had come, on this day to losing everything they loved because one crew had refused to let them. But the battle was not over. The Kryvex commander, watching its decapitation strike unravel against a single ship's stubborn, impossible defiance, made a choice that would reveal the true, terrible scale of what the Council and humanity were actually facing. Before it did, though, there was a moment, brief, almost unnoticed amid the chaos of the wider engagement, that would later be replayed and studied more closely than almost any other single frame of sensor footage from the entire battle. A Kryvex corvette, cut off from its retreating flank formation and drifting, crippled, directly into Prometheus's debt's firing arc, found itself suddenly inexplicably not fired upon. "Captain, I have a clean shot on that corvette," Achari said. "Confirmed disabled, no weapon signature, they're just drifting." Reyes glanced at the display for less than a second. "Hold fire. They're not a threat anymore. Redirect to the capital ships." "Captain, with respect, that's still an enemy vessel." "It's a wreck with people on it who can't shoot back," Reyes said. "We don't finish off things that can't fight anymore, Lieutenant. Not when there's a real threat left to deal with. Redirect." It was a small decision, in the scale of everything else happening in those minutes, and it would have gone entirely unnoticed by the Council, had the platform's own long-range sensors not happened to capture it in passing. But Vesadaru, reviewing the full sensor logs in the days that followed the battle, would return to that single frame more often than almost any other, a human warship, mid-battle, burning through its own reactor to survive an overwhelming enemy force, choosing in the middle of that fight to spare a crippled ship that posed it no further danger. It was not strategy. It gained the ship nothing. It was, Vess would eventually conclude, simply who they were, even when no one was watching, even when it cost them nothing to be otherwise. It ordered its flagship forward, and the flagship was carrying something no one in the chamber, human or otherwise, had yet detected.